In December 1967, an American Navy vessel called the Pueblo departed Pearl Harbor, heading for Yokosuka, Japan. It was the last time the ship, a dilapidated former cargo carrier now operating as an American intelligence collector, would see the United States. In January, the Pueblo began its first mission, conducting electronic intelligence operations off the coast of North Korea. Then, on January 23, 1968, 50 years ago today, the ship came under attack by North Korean forces. The slow and poorly armed American ship was badly overmatched. The captain soon surrendered, with 1 dead and numerous wounded. North Korean forces quickly boarded the Pueblo and towed the ship and her 83 crewmen to Wonsan. The men spent a brutal year in North Korean prison camps where they were beaten, tortured, and used as propaganda tools, before being released a few days before Christmas 1968. The ship is still in North Korea, serving as one of the country's leading tourist attractions. The story of the Pueblo incident, long forgotten by most Americans, is certainly important on its own merits. Beyond the details of the attack, however, the crisis also serves as a larger example of how America's war in Vietnam had ramifications far beyond Southeast Asia. Wonsan and Hanoi were 2,000 miles apart, but the war in Vietnam hovered over the Pueblo seizure from the beginning. When news of the attack reached the White House, the Johnson administration instinctively pointed a finger of blame not at Pyongyang but at a larger communist conspiracy. The president told his advisers that the incident was related to the whole picture, adding that he would not be surprised if something happened in Berlin to coincide with what is going on in Vietnam and in Korea. The Soviets soon began sending back-channel signals that they had not been involved, but the Johnson administration refused to accept the possibility that North Korea might have acted independently. Instead, President Lyndon Johnson and his advisers continued to search for larger Cold War connections to explain the attack, and soon found them in Vietnam. The director of the CIA, Richard Helms, warned that the North had acted for 2 reasons: to hinder the movement of Koreans to South Vietnam and to harass the U.S. in its conduct of the war in Vietnam. Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Nitze speculated that the attack had been intended to pressure the United States into taking a weaker position on Vietnam negotiations. When the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive a week after the seizure, the link between the two seemed confirmed. The North Koreans, Johnson wrote, were aware of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which was scheduled to take place 8 days later. They were trying to divert U.S. military resources from Vietnam and pressure the South Koreans into recalling their 2 divisions from that area. Recently released materials from Communist bloc archives, however, demonstrate that there was no conspiracy behind the Pueblo seizure. The North Koreans had acted alone, and for reasons that reflected internal dynamics within Pyongyang rather than the exigencies of the Cold War. The country had launched this and other aggressive actions on the peninsula to gain internal propaganda that emphasized the strength of Kim Il-sung's leadership and to rally the people behind him during difficult economic and political times. In fact, not only was there no larger conspiracy afoot, but the Pueblo attack actually drove a wedge between the North and its communist allies, who resented Pyongyang's risky behavior and its reluctance to provide information. In April, the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev blasted the North in a speech at the Soviet Party plenum. The measures taken in this case by the government of the DPRK appear unusually harsh, he declared. Moscow had demanded that North Korea show reserve, not to give the Americans an excuse for widening provocations, to settle the incident by political means. But, he said, the Korean comrades maintained a fairly extreme position and did not show any inclination toward the settlement of the incident. Other members of the Communist bloc similarly resented Kim's provocations. In newspaper articles and statements, "We were on their side," the East German ambassador to Pyongyang later explained, but not in reality. American political leaders, however, failed to consider the possibility of an internal motive and instinctively sought solutions rooted in conventional Cold War approaches that presumed a larger master hand was behind North Korea's behavior. Throughout 1968, American policymakers negotiated with North Korean representatives but never fully accepted the idea that this diplomatic effort could be separated from the larger Cold War struggle. Accordingly, they rejected any resolution that might weaken their efforts on other fronts, particularly in Vietnam. The great danger that we must avoid is that the Soviets and the North Vietnamese will interpret something that we do as a sign of weakness, outgoing Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara explained. "If we show weakness and are not firm, I think it will prolong the Vietnam War substantially." Negotiations for the prisoners in North Korea were thus held hostage by events in Saigon. Beyond the immediate fears about sending signs of weakness, American policymakers also failed to consider the possibility that they might be able to drive a wedge between the North Koreans and the rest of the Communist bloc even further. The North's relations within its allies had fallen so low by 1968 that it was engaging in border skirmishes with the Chinese while also alienating its other allies, and yet the United States continued to negotiate as if it faced a unified monolith. As galling as it is, a National Security Council staff member advised in March, "I fear that on this Pueblo case we may have to lick our wounds, wait out release of the crew, and wait our chances for action when the advantage is more ours. The only way I see where we could act sooner would be in Vietnam, presumably by mining Haiphong Harbor." North Korean actions seem partly designed to aid the Communist Vietnam effort, and it is important that we not permit that to happen. Unable to separate Vietnam from Korea, American leaders had thus sent its diplomats to do battle for the Pueblo crewmen in a badly weakened position. America's diplomatic response was not the only part of the Pueblo story that was influenced by Vietnam. The attack on the ship sent both the American military and the general public into a frenzy. Demands for violent retaliation echoed through the halls of the Pentagon and the streets of America's towns. The Office of the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet recommended sending a destroyer into Wonsan to do whatever was necessary to retrieve the ship and crew, and the commander of the United Nations forces in South Korea, an American, called for a nuclear ultimatum. The public was equally aggressive. A Gallup poll showed those choosing force outnumbered those choosing diplomacy by almost 2-1. "There should be no word mincing in our demand for the swift and safe return of both ship and crew," the Buffalo Daily News wrote, "nor should North Korea be deprived for long of the measured dose of retribution her sudden belligerency has so emphatically asked for." The military options, however, soon ran into a number of practical obstacles, including the strong North Korean defenses in the Wonsan area, the risk of conflict with the Soviets or Chinese, and concerns for the safety of the Pueblo crewmen. Hovering over all of the discussions, though, were the demands of fighting the war in Vietnam. Begrudgingly, military leaders soon recognized that opening another front in East Asia would be a terrible tactical decision. Within a week of the attack, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs offered Johnson almost a dozen military options, ranging from mining North Korean ports to striking targets with air and naval bombardments, but admitted that he did not find any of them particularly attractive. Accordingly, military options were discarded. One war at a time, Under Secretary of State Nicholas Katzenbach said, is enough. Even the public's response to the crisis was shaped by events in Vietnam. For a week after the incident, the Pueblo was the focus of national attention. Newspapers ran profiles of brave sailors captured by the evil communists. Songs about the Pueblo graced the airwaves, cars displayed bumper stickers about the ship, and telegrams from private citizens offering to assist in rescue attempts flooded the White House. These men, promised the State Department, are not, nor will they ever become, forgotten men. Yet, when the Tet Offensive exploded on January 30, American eyes quickly returned to Vietnam. Soon, Walter Cronkite called for an honorable exit from Vietnam. A national debate exploded about the military's request for more troops, and Johnson announced that largely because of Vietnam, he would not run for re-election. In the haze of such Vietnam-related tumult, the Pueblo simply faded from the nation's consciousness. Supporters of the crew formed a national Remember the Pueblo committee and offered a rallying cry to remember the Pueblo, to try to keep the men in the public eye, but to no avail. The crew, despite the State Department's promise, had indeed become forgotten men, lost to the more overwhelming conflict 2,000 miles away. And despite suffering from serious physical and emotional problems resulting from their year in captivity, the men would remain forgotten when they returned to the United States in December 1968. Quickly, they were drummed from the service, ignored by the general public and left to fend for themselves as they struggled to reintegrate with society, often with disastrous results. Even more significant than these immediate connections, however, was the impact that the convergence of Vietnam and the Pueblo incident had on shaping the long-term American commitment to South Korea. American aid to the South had been declining for years, and America's military presence was coming under scrutiny as well. These efforts were stymied, however, by South Korea's decision to commit troops to the American effort in Vietnam. By 1967, South Korea had provided tens of thousands of combat troops, and in return, a grateful President Johnson had been ignoring the drawdown proposals. The attack on the Pueblo now offered the South a chance to strengthen the relationship even more. President Park Chung-hee of South Korea and other leaders suddenly began hinting that they might withdraw their troops from Vietnam to face the increased North Korean aggression. Johnson, who desperately wanted to portray Vietnam as an international effort, was determined to keep them on board. Accordingly, he pushed through an enormous military assistance package for the South. "We need to give whatever aid is necessary to South Korea," he told congressional leaders. "They are among our best allies." Johnson took other measures to placate Park, including pledging to appoint a South Korean as deputy commander of the United Nations military forces in Korea, promising to increase South Korean access to business opportunities in Vietnam and working to increase economic connections between the nations. In the long run, of course, South Korean forces fighting in Vietnam could not prevent America's defeat. They did, however, restore a bond that had been weakening and help cement a special relationship between the countries that still exists. 50 years after the attack on the Pueblo, the ship's story remains the tragic tale of 83 American men and a doomed spy ship. But it is also a story of how the impact of America's war in Vietnam went beyond Vietnam in ways that hindered good diplomacy elsewhere, ruined the lives of people far from the front lines and played a vital role in shaping the future of East Asia.